Good evening. This is Atheist History Week, and I'm John Rafferty, the president of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and also a proud and active member of New York City Atheists, which produces this show. Each week at this hour, we look at the week's events, anniversaries, birthdays, in the history of atheism and free thought in general, secularism, rationalism, humanism, humanism, pragmatism. We discuss notable people, the famous and the not so famous, and some of the infamous, who were born or died or did something significant during this week, generally speaking, time frame in history, going all the way back to ancient times and up to people who are alive and working today. We also cover, when appropriate, certain events, the publication of major books or articles, the religious fun and games like burnings at the stake or heresy trials, all those faith-based fun and games for which religion is so famous in our history. Let's start this evening with some British poets. Percy Shelley was born on August 4th in 1792. He is always referred to as Percy, B-Y-S-S-H-E, Shelley, and even though I spent 3 years as an English major in college, I still don't know how to pronounce B-Y-S-S-H-E. Let's leave it alone. Shelley was an outspoken atheist for his time, in his time and for his time. He made no bones about it right from his undergraduate days in school. In college, he was expelled from Oxford for writing The Necessity of Atheism in 1811, a pamphlet whose first words were, there is no God. And he defended his position and continued it throughout his short life. He also wrote a refutation of deism, which he considered sort of soft-core religion, let's put it that way. People who thought that deism, very popular in the 18th century, including among our American founding fathers, as a kind of cop-out. They didn't believe in God, but they sort of deists talked about and wrote about a moving force that got things started and then left us all alone, which was, it's religion, it's God, but it's soft core, as I say. He also wrote The Revolt of Islam, An Ode to Liberty, and he stayed pretty active in his personal life too. He was married, very unhappily, but had a couple of children, and then ran off with Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, the daughter of another atheist, William Godwin, and two atheists, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. Shelley and Mary ran off to the continent, getting out of England, where things are a little too hot for them, and they traveled around the continent with the young Lord Byron. And they had a little contest in deciding to write something in a very brief period of time. And I don't even know who won the contest, but Mary won the contest, really. She wrote Frankenstein, which is called, by the way, Frankenstein or the New Prometheus. Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound a little later, and Prometheus, as you will remember from Greek mythology, was I think half god, but certainly a deity who was punished by the Supreme Soviet of Gods for giving knowledge and fire to man. If that sounds a little bit like the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, yeah, it is. They're all the same. Shelley, at Byron's invitation, sailed to Pisa in Italy to consult over a new magazine that they were about to put together. And on the return trip, their yacht was caught in a storm, and he died at the age of 29. Religion. But for thee, prolific fiend, who peoplest earth with demons, hell with men, and heaven with slaves. That's Shelley in Queen Mab. If ignorance of nature gave birth to gods, knowledge of nature is made for their destruction. And his attitude towards Christianity. In A Refutation of Deism in 1814, he wrote, Christianity indeed has equaled Judaism in the atrocities and exceeded it in the extent of its desolation. 11 millions of men, women, and children have been killed in battle, butchered in their sleep, burned to death at public festivals of sacrifice, poisoned, tortured, assassinated, and pillaged in the spirit of the religion of peace and for the glory of a most merciful God. Percy Shelley, born August 4th, 1792, and died in 1822. Midway through Shelley's life, in 1809, on August 6th, Alfred Tennyson was born. In England. Probably the most popular poet of his time, and perhaps indeed of the entire 19th century in England. Tennyson was one of those soft-core religionists that I spoke of a little while ago, a deistic pantheist. So easy to say that, you know, like today, they're the equivalent then of today's screwballs with their crystals and their aromas and the rest of it. If I'm offending anyone out there in the audience, good. He famously wrote in memoriam, there lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds. I've seen that quote in so many free thought publications. It's one of the best ones. Honest doubt, better than any kind of creed. And in Maud in 1855 he wrote, the churches have killed their Christ. Christian love among the churches looked the twin of heathen hate. And in Becket he wrote, we are self-certain creatures, and we may, yea, even when we know not, mix our spites and private hates with our defense of heaven. Tennyson had a long, distinguished career throughout the Victorian era in England. His life spanned almost the entire 19th century, from 1809 to 1892, and his son wrote his biography and confirmed that he was Tennyson himself. Alfred Lord Tennyson was no Christian. Towards the end of the century, a poet who might have gone on to great things, but who died in the First World War, Rupert Brooke, was born on August 3rd in 1887. And he was stuck with the sobriquet, I think, of the handsomest young man in England, which was what William Butler Yeats called him. And he was an interesting and fine young poet who died ignominiously during the First World War of a mosquito bite that became infected. Churchill wrote his obituary at his death, and he was a very, very strong doubter. And he wrote a poem about how we anthropomorphize the whole idea of gods and heaven and all the rest of it. And he did so by comparing us to fish in the poem Heaven. Fish fly replete in depth of June, dawdling away their watery noon, ponder deep wisdom, dark or clear, each secret fishy hope or fear. Fish say they have stream and pond, but is there anything beyond? This life cannot be all, they swear, for how unpleasant if it were. One may not doubt that somehow good shall come of water and of mud. And sure the reverend eye must see a purpose in liquidity. We darkly know, by faith we cry, the future is not wholly dry. Mud unto mud, death eddies near, not here the appointed end, not here, but somewhere beyond space and time is wetter water, slimier slime. And there they trust, there swimmeth one who swam ere rivers were begun, immense, of fishy form and mind, squamous, omnipotent and kind. And under that almighty fin, the littlest fish may enter in. Oh, never fly conceals a hook, fish say, in the eternal brook. But more than mundane weeds are there, and mud celestially fair. Fat caterpillars drift around, and paradisal grubs are found. And the worm that never die, unfading moths, immortal flies, and the worm that never dies. And then in that heaven of all their wish, there shall be no more land, say fish. I love that. It's so much fun. Not a poet, but one of the most important contemporary writers around today is someone you might not think of. The woman who drives American presidents crazy, Helen Thomas. The White House correspondent, who was born on August 4th in 1921, and who is now called the Grande Dame of journalism, the first woman of journalism, and a White House correspondent for more than 40 years. She has written a couple of books about her experiences. She rattled not only American presidents, but Fidel Castro, when who refused to talk to her. He was afraid of her probing questions. She worked for many, many years for UPI, once called United Press International, now just called UPI, when in 2000 it was bought by the Unification Church. She would not work for the Reverend Moon, even if he did claim to be God. And she went to work for the Hearst newspapers, and she has been called by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. She's been described as tenacious and unrelenting in her condemnation of faith-based funding schemes, of our 180-degree changes in foreign policy to endorse preemptive strikes, of the war, that is the Iraqi war, and of the secrecy and unanswered questions behind the war. Helen Thomas could be resting on her laurels. Instead, she is plunging into the fray as the conscience of Washington, D.C. Helen Thomas calls herself a non-denominational believer, but we're celebrating her because she is such an ardent believer in the separation of church and state, which is perhaps the most important idea that free thinkers today have to deal with. After quite a few assaults on our First Amendment over the last couple of decades, and I don't excuse the Democratic administrations from those, the most important thing we have to do is shore up our separate the wall state. At the very first press conference that George W. Bush held as president in February 2002, Helen Thomas, the Grand Lady, is of course called on. She went right to the point in asking him about his new faith-based initiatives to grant public dollars to religious charities. "Mr. President," she said, "why do you refuse to respect the wall between the church and state? And you know that the mixing of religion and government for centuries has led to slaughter. I mean, the very fact that our country has stood in good stead by having the separation, why do you break it down?" President Bush answered, "Helen, I strongly respect the separation of church and state." And she interrupted him. She cut him right off. "Well, you wouldn't have a religious office in the White House if you did. You're a secular official and not a missionary." Unfortunately, she was wrong in that. He was a missionary. Helen, atheists pay taxes to Thomas. Born August 4th, 1921, and still going strong. Another writer of a more distinguished literary reputation is the short story, greatest maybe, Guy de Maupassant. The French writer who was born on August 5th in 1850, Henri René Albert Guy de Maupassant. He was born in 1850, which made him just in time for the Franco-Prussian War, in which he fought, and he began writing short stories. As a matter of fact, I had a collection of his stories that I was reading, college age, and my father picked it up one day and wanted to know why I was reading this filth. I forget which one he spotted, but naturally he opened it up and turned immediately to some story about a prostitute. And I said, "Well, I'm taking French in college, Okay. My father was a good guy, but all right. De Maupassant wrote more than 300 short stories, and he was disdainful of religion over and over in his stories. The local cure in the little village, or the monk, or even the bishop, is venal and grasping and lecherous over and over and over again. So much so that, whether it's actually true or not, that's the image that we have of French country life in the 19th century because of what de Maupassant wrote. One of his most famous short stories was in 1880, was titled, well, in English, Ball of Fat. And it served to be one of the plot lines in John Ford's movie Stagecoach. Those of you who have seen that classic movie may remember that a prostitute, she never called that in the movie, of course, played by Claire Trevor, is treated with disdain by the other passengers on the stagecoach. And if you were a kid, you wondered why didn't they like her, and if you were an adult, you understood why they didn't like her, because she was a prostitute. Well, the great classic movie took that sequence from de Maupassant's story, Ball of Fat. And of course what it what it was all about was the hypocrisy of the bourgeois, as they would say in French, or middle class, as we would say in America, towards the low-life woman who eventually proves to be a better person than any of them. Lesser known, he wrote a story called Pierre and Jean, which was a psychological study, actually, of adultery between a woman who was having with her husband. She was having sex with her husband and with his brother, and it was turned into a film in 1951 by Louis Buñuel, and many of de Maupassant's stories have been adapted as movies in France. And one of his horror stories, The Inn, was just taken by Stephen King and turned into The Shining, which is, of course, about the madness inflicted on an isolated mountain caretaker. De Maupassant has never made any public statements about his religious or atheistic beliefs or any kind. But all you got to do is read his stories and know this is a man who had nothing but contempt for religion. Sort of analogous in America, roughly, well, earlier actually, Herman Melville was born in 1819 on August 1st. His father died when Herman was 12. He had 7 brothers and sisters, and he had to go to work to help support the family. And so in 1830, he did, and then probably to get away from it all, at the age of roughly 19 or 20 in 1839, he went to sea as a cabin boy, and went to the South Seas. He later on joined the U.S. Navy. He was shipwrecked among the Taipei cannibals and dramatically rescued. And these and the other exploits of a young man in the South Seas in the middle of the 19th century. I mean, this is the stuff of great drama, romance. And he turned it into 2 enormously successful novels. Taipei in 1846 and Omu in 1847. But of course, the great one is Moby Dick, with its famous first line, "Call me Ishmael," which, if you have forgotten your biblical stories or didn't know it in the first place, Ishmael is the bastard son who is driven out and who eventually becomes the father of the Arab nations. Ahab, the captain, in his obsessive quest for the white whale, Moby Dick, is named for the very same biblical king who was overthrown in a revolt and defenestrated, a word I learned from my professor of ancient history. Defenestrated means thrown out the window. And 30 of us in the class roared our heads off. We learned a new word, being thrown out the window, defenestrated. At any rate, Melville wrote about obsession, and the comparison between Ahab's obsession with the whale and man's obsession with God is very, very obvious once you read it. He wrote to Nathaniel Hawthorne, "I have written a wicked book and feel as spotless as the lamb." He became a member of a Unitarian church in New York, but his writings were always about doubt and the exploration of good and evil. And Unitarianism then, as now, I suppose, was even more so then, the intellectuals' way of saying, putting all the nonsense about Christianity aside and just, again, soft-core religion. Herman Melville, born August 1st in 1819.
Wherever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers.